Marie Curie was born Maria Salomea Sklodowska, but in France she was called Marie, for ease of pronunciation, on November 7, 1867, in Warsaw, Poland, then under the rule of the Russian Empire. She was the daughter of a mathematics professor and the headmistress of a girls' boarding school. She was the youngest of 5 children. Her family, with a tradition of academics, suffered financial difficulties after losing their savings in failed investments. Since she displayed a prodigious memory and a tremendous interest in science from a young age, her educated but impoverished middle-class family fostered her love of knowledge, something exceptional in an era when women were educated to be wives and mothers. At that time, girls with resources received basic education, but scientific or university studies were almost impossible. They could only access female education, limited to what was considered useful: reading, writing, sewing, and languages. Science was seen as inappropriate for them. Marie Curie grew up in an environment marked by political oppression and educational limitations for women. The university in her native Warsaw, like most universities, was exclusively for men. Only a few, like Marie, managed to access higher education, often abroad. Therefore, she studied at the clandestine Flying University in Warsaw, a secret institution where women could pursue education. Science and literature were taught in Polish to women and young women who were prohibited from attending university. Transportation was primarily carts, horse-drawn trams, or steam-powered cars in the cities. A woman could not easily travel alone. It was frowned upon. There were few jobs available for women: governesses, teachers, laundresses, or maids. Marie worked as a governess for years to finance her sister Bronia's studies, with the agreement that her sister would later help her study in France. In 1891, at the age of 24, she traveled to Paris alone, something very unusual and risky for a woman at that time, to continue her education at the Sorbonne, a university in Paris. The Sorbonne had only opened its doors to women a few years earlier, and they were an absolute minority, just a few dozen among thousands of men. A woman at the university was seen as strange or eccentric. She wasn't expected to work in science. She would eventually become a teacher or return home. They couldn't vote, access high academic positions, or participate in many scientific societies. In France, Marie faced gender prejudice, but at least she was able to study. Student life was harsh. She lived in precarious conditions, a cold room, undernourished, and suffering extreme poverty. However, she dedicated herself completely to her studies. While many male classmates had family support. In 1893, she earned her bachelor's degree in physics, first in her class. In 1894, she also completed her degree in mathematics. During Marie Curie's time, meaning the late 19th and early 20th centuries, women faced absurd restrictions, such as access to libraries and academic spaces. These restrictions varied by country, social norms, and the type of institution. In some respectable libraries, women generally required a male escort. They were not allowed to consult certain books, such as medical or engineering textbooks, because they were considered inappropriate and were physically segregated. For example, at the National Library of France, until the 1920s, women had to sit in separate areas from men. In the specific case of Marie Curie in Paris in 1890, although the Sorbonne was more progressive, women were still a minority. Marie spent hours in the university library, but she could not work in mixed laboratories at first until Pierre Curie, her future husband, intervened. Her achievements were attributed to men. Even after winning her first Nobel Prize, the press said she was her husband's assistant. That same year, she met Pierre Curie, a brilliant physicist, and they married in 1895. She was a practical woman and committed to her work, so much so that when Marie married Pierre Curie, she wore a borrowed wedding dress. She didn't want to spend money on a traditional white gown. She opted for a more practical dark blue one, and after the ceremony, she returned to the laboratory to continue working. Their relationship was unusual, a marriage of equals, based on scientific collaboration, something very rare. Marie and Pierre were cycling enthusiasts. On their honeymoon, they cycled around France, carrying tools to repair punctures. Later, they used the bikes to commute to the laboratory. At that time, the expectation of a married woman was to dedicate herself to the home and children. Marie challenged that standard. Together, they began research into radiation, inspired by Henri Becquerel's 1896 discoveries about the radioactivity of uranium. Marie was the one who coined the term radioactivity. It is said that she worked with radium test tubes that she kept in her pocket and used as lamps at night because they glowed in the dark. In 1898, Marie and Pierre announced the discovery of two new elements. Polonium, named after Poland, their native country. Radium, an element millions of times more radioactive than uranium. To isolate these elements, they processed tons of pitchblende, a uranium ore, under extremely harsh conditions and without protection, which would later have consequences for their health. They could not patent their discoveries because profiting from science was frowned upon, but also because it was questionable whether a woman had rights to industrial discoveries. In laboratories and at conferences, Marie was the only woman. Credit was often given to Pierre. Regarding mobility and daily life, the couple traveled on electric trams, recently introduced in Paris, or walked long distances. Marie lived very modestly, without luxury, devoting her time to work. In 1903, Marie defended her doctorate in physical sciences, the first woman in France to do so. In 1903, Marie Curie, Pierre Curie, and Henri Becquerel received the Nobel Prize in Physics for their studies on radioactivity. Initially, the committee refused to include her, but Pierre insisted that Marie was as deserving as he was. Pierre Curie publicly defended her, and thanks to his support, she was finally included. Marie was 35 years old and became the first woman to receive a Nobel Prize in history. While men like Einstein were celebrated without question, Marie was judged by her gender, with her knowledge and contributions always questioned. There was a respectful skepticism about women's ability to contribute to science, and women were often considered assistants to their husbands or male colleagues. In 1906, Pierre died tragically in a car accident, struck by a horse-drawn carriage. Marie was widowed at 38, with two young daughters. She was devastated, but instead of retiring, she took up her position as a professor at the Sorbonne, becoming the first female professor there. A widowed scientist was doubly rare. Society expected her to rely on male relatives or devote herself solely to her daughters. It was the first time a woman spoke to lecture halls full of male academics in Paris. Among students, Marie was highly respected and admired for her knowledge. Many considered her an exceptional mentor. However, some male colleagues underestimated her or viewed her with suspicion, as it was unusual for a woman to hold an academic leadership role. At academic meetings and scientific societies, she was often denied a voice or treated as exceptional, more out of curiosity than real authority. Her achievements were recognized, but her authority was not always equal to that of men, and she had to continually prove her competence. Unlike her male colleagues, Marie sometimes worked in modest, poorly equipped laboratories, especially at the beginning. He had to balance teaching, his research, and raising his daughters, something few men at the time faced. In 1911, she received her second Nobel Prize, this time in chemistry, for the isolation of radium and polonium, and for advances in techniques for studying radioactive elements. Marie had managed to isolate 1 gram of pure radium, an incredibly laborious task. She processed tons of pitchblende to obtain just a few grams. Her research laid the foundations of nuclear chemistry and radiotherapy, demonstrating that her work had a global impact. Thus, she became the first person to receive 2 Nobel Prizes in different sciences. However, at the same time, she suffered a smear campaign for having a romantic relationship with the physicist Paul Langevin, a married but separated man. Paul was never judged with such harshness, which demonstrates the moral double standard. Male scientists had affairs without consequences, but only she was attacked. The scandal arose because she was a woman, a foreigner, and famous. Few understood and spoke out, like Albert Einstein, who, when the press attacked Marie for her relationship with Paul Langevin, wrote her a letter of support. "I admire your intelligence and I don't care about gossip." After winning her second Nobel Prize, Marie applied to the French Academy of Sciences. She lost by 2 votes to 1, and the president declared, "Women cannot be part of the Academy." So despite her success, the French Academy of Sciences did not admit her as a member simply because she was a woman. In fact, it wasn't until 1962, 51 years later, that a female scientist finally joined, Marie Curie, discoverer of francium, who became the first female member. For Marie Curie, being accepted into the French Academy of Sciences was not only a personal honor, but a crucial battle for scientific recognition, gender equality, and the legitimacy of her work in a male-dominated system. The Academy was France's highest scientific body, and membership meant institutional validation. Without it, many men continued to question her authority. Furthermore, membership meant access to resources, priority research funding, laboratories, and collaborations. Marie needed this for her work with radium. Having been excluded, she relied on private donations or her own salary. For Marie, joining the Academy would have been an endorsement of her professional integrity. On the other hand, Pierre had been a member of the Academy, and Marie wanted to continue his work on equal terms. After his death in 1906, she took over his chair at the Sorbonne, but the Academy resisted treating her as a colleague. She was the first person to receive 2 Nobel Prizes in different fields and remains the only person to have done so, but the French Academy chose to keep its doors closed to women until 1962. Her rejection is a reminder that, even for the most brilliant minds, merit doesn't always triumph over prejudice. As she famously put it, in science, we should be interested in things, not people. In 1914, at the outbreak of war, she organized mobile X-ray teams, known as the Petites Curies, which brought radiology to the battlefields and helped diagnose wounds on the front lines. She trained female volunteers, including her daughter Irene, in radiology. She taught women how to operate the machines, something revolutionary, since during the war, men were soldiers and women were relegated to nurses. Furthermore, during the war, despite women beginning to occupy male positions in factories, transportation, and hospitals, they were pressured to return home after the war. Marie seized that opportunity to demonstrate that a woman could lead high-level technical operations. During the war, Marie attempted to donate her Nobel Prize gold medals to fund the war effort, but the Bank of France refused to accept them. Instead, she used the prize money to buy war bonds. Thanks to her work, countless lives of wounded soldiers were saved. In 1914, she created the Radium Institute in Paris and Warsaw, which became world centers of research, where she continued to work tirelessly. She never patented the radium isolation process because she believed that science should be at the service of humanity. Marie could have become a millionaire with the discovery of radium, but she chose not to patent it so that the scientific community could pursue research without restrictions. She toured the United States in 1921, welcomed as a hero, to raise funds for her research, where she was greatly supported by American women, who saw her as a symbol of feminine power in science. In many countries, women were only just beginning to gain the right to vote, but they would not achieve this until 1944, 10 years after her death in France. Her constant exposure to radiation, at a time when protective measures were unavailable, seriously deteriorated her health. Neither she nor Pierre knew how dangerous it was. She died on July 4, 1934, exhausted by radiation exposure in a sanatorium in France due to radiation-induced aplastic anemia. In 1995, her remains and those of Pierre were transferred to the Pantheon in Paris, making her the first woman to be buried there on her own merit. Although the two now rest together in the Pantheon in Paris, France initially refused to bury her there because she was a woman. It was not until 1995, 61 years after her death, that the French government recognized her merits and transferred her to the Pantheon. Since the 18th century, the Pantheon in Paris has been designated a mausoleum for great French figures who have contributed to their country in science, politics, literature, and philosophy. Figures such as Voltaire, Rousseau, Victor Hugo, Émile Zola, Alexandre Dumas, and others rest in its crypts. It is a national symbol. To be there means to be considered a hero of France and of humanity. In the case of Marie Curie, she was initially buried alongside her husband Pierre in Sauze, south of Paris, but decades later, in 1995, the French government decided to move her remains to the Pantheon in Paris. President François Mitterrand justified the decision by recognizing her as a scientific pioneer and a universal example. With this transfer, Marie became the first woman to be laid to rest there for her own scientific merits. Before her, there were women in the Pantheon, but always as companions to famous men, not for their own recognition. Her induction represented an act of historical reparation, because during her lifetime she was marginalized in academia and personally attacked, despite her achievements. When Pierre died in 1906, Marie kept a jar of soil from his grave and placed it next to her bed for years. Today, her grave is next to Pierre Curie's. To this day, their graves remain radioactive. Marie and Pierre worked with radium and polonium, two highly radioactive elements. At that time, in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the risks were unknown, and they did not use protection. They handled samples with their hands, kept jars in their pockets, and even kept them in their homes. When the remains of Marie and Pierre Curie were transferred to the Pantheon in Paris in 1995, special precautions were taken. Their coffins were lined with lead to prevent the release of radiation. Although radioactivity has decreased over time, the remains still emit considerable levels of radiation and therefore remain sealed. This makes the Pantheon in Paris unique. It houses radioactive tombs. The radiation emitted by the bodies is minimal for a person outside the coffin. So, a person walking or visiting the Pantheon is not at risk. The radiation is sufficient to require precautions only if one attempts to open or manipulate the coffins. Beyond its striking nature, it is also a reminder of Marie Curie's sacrifice. She gave her life for science, and even in death remains linked to it. Regarding her personal life, Marie Curie had two daughters. Irene Joliot-Curie, 1897 to 1956, a physicist and chemist, who also won the Nobel Prize in Chemistry in 1935 for discovering artificial radioactivity, thus perpetuating the legacy of women in science, and Eve Curie, 1904 to 2007, writer and journalist, author of the famous biography Madame Curie. The Curie family became a true Nobel lineage. Marie, Pierre, Irene, and her husband Frederick together won 5 Nobel Prizes. Marie Curie was a pioneer of radioactivity. She paved the way for nuclear physics and medical applications such as radiotherapy for cancer and modern chemistry. She is a model of perseverance. She broke gender barriers in science, demonstrating that women could lead high-level research in a male-dominated world. She challenged stereotypes, being a mother, widow, and scientist all at the same time. In her time, only men could access laboratories, funding, and recognition without obstacles. The institutions she founded, such as the Curie Institute in Paris and Warsaw, remain top-level research centers. Her life symbolizes the passion for knowledge and the social commitment of science. In an era where women were expected to know how to sew and take care of the home, Marie mastered advanced mathematics. While laboratories and academies were open to men, she had to fight for a place, often working in precarious conditions. Her private relationships were publicly judged, something that rarely happened with male scientists, and although she won 2 Nobel Prizes, many contemporaries tried to make her invisible, reducing her to Pierre's sidekick. Marie opened a completely new path in science. Before her, the idea that matter could spontaneously disintegrate and release invisible energy didn't exist. Her work paved the way for nuclear physics, modern chemistry, and radiation-based medicine. Thanks to her discoveries, we now have radiotherapy. Radium and polonium opened the door to radiotherapy. Millions of cancer patients benefit from treatments that destroy tumors through controlled radiation. Mobile X-rays. From X-rays in war to today's tomography, everything has its roots in the understanding of radioactivity. Her Petites Curies, portable radiological units during World War I, evolved into the modern medical scanners we know today. Nuclear energy. Her discoveries have led us from reactors to space missions. Although controversial, nuclear energy has been one of the largest sources of low-carbon energy, the most cost-effective and cleanest known to date. Her studies on atomic decay led to the development of nuclear reactors, which are used to generate electricity in countries like France, which obtains approximately 70% of its energy from nuclear power plants. Medical radioisotopes used in diagnostic imaging. Powering space probes like Perseverance on Mars, which uses plutonium-238, derived from her research. Her methods inspired generations of scientists in their search for the invisible. Marie Curie founded the theory of radioactivity, essential for understanding the structure of the atom, which inspired Rutherford and Bohr, nuclear weapons, although she opposed their military use, and carbon-14 dating, used in archaeology and paleontology. Her contribution was not only scientific, but also human and social. At a time when being a woman was almost condemned to silence, Curie demonstrated that talent has no gender. She was a pioneer not only in laboratories, but also in the symbolic fight for women's right to education, recognition, and leadership in male-dominated fields. Her life is also a reminder of the price of knowledge. Marie worked without truly knowing the risks of radiation. She kept radium samples in her pockets, fascinated by the glow they emitted in the dark, without any protection. Marie didn't know how dangerous radiation was. Her notebooks, clothing, and even cooking recipes are so contaminated with radium that, today, they are kept in lead-lined boxes at the National Library of France. In fact, to access them, you must sign a release and wear a protective suit. The radiation emitted comes primarily from alpha particles, which are very powerful but do not penetrate the skin. The only danger is if someone ingests or inhales radioactive dust. That's why they are stored in lead boxes and handled with gloves and masks. Marie Curie's most radioactive objects, small pieces of pure radium, could kill in a few minutes if ingested, but at normal distances they have no effect on visitors. To give you an idea, her library is more dangerous than the tomb, because the books contain radioactive dust that can be released. This constant contact with radiation slowly deteriorated her body until she died in 1934. She sacrificed her own life to light the way for science. Curie died in 1934 unaware that her discoveries would take humanity to new horizons, such as the atomic bomb, whose use her daughter Irene criticized in Hiroshima, nuclear power plants in France, where her adopted country is a world leader in this energy, and cancer immunotherapy based on targeted radiation. So, Marie Curie not only changed 20th century science, but her discoveries continue to save lives, generate energy, and expand human knowledge. Furthermore, her personal fight against gender bias makes her an eternal symbol of resilience and intelligence. Today, every cancer treatment, every X-ray image, every breakthrough in nuclear physics is an echo of her sacrifice. Humanity owes her not only discoveries, but also the inspiration of someone who put science above her personal interests, who rejected patents so that knowledge could be free, and who chose to forge ahead even when she lost her husband and was publicly attacked for her private life. Simply put, Marie Curie taught us that knowledge transforms the world, but that it also demands courage, dedication, and, in her case, even life itself. Marie Curie not only changed science, she challenged a system that denied women the right to be geniuses. Her life is a reminder that talent has no gender, but society does impose limits, which she broke. Her legacy reminds us that science is not only a path to answers, but also to courage, perseverance, and faith in humanity. She herself expressed it best. Nothing in life should be feared, only understood. Now is the time to understand more, in order to fear less. And with that vision, Marie Curie continues to illuminate the world.